Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming back for the discussion. There are four of us on stage. I am Professor Catherine Loveday, and I'm a neuropsychologist from the University of Westminster. Over here, we have Harry Whalley, the composer of the piece you've just listened to. Harry is a reader in sound and music at the University for the Creative Arts. His work sits at the intersection of art and science. Outside of composing music for film and the concert hall, Harry also works to facilitate workshops for people living with dementia using music. Alexander McCall Smith is a novelist. He was provisionally Professor of Medical Law at the University of Edinburgh and served on various bioethical committees, including UNESCO's Bioethics Commission. He has collaborated with a number of composers on a number of operas and song cycles. And Professor Adam Zeman is a neurologist, a medical doctor, but also has a background in philosophy and psychology, I believe, and neurology, and is the author of Consciousness, a User's Guide, and also a Portrait of the Brain, and a new one coming soon, I think, called A Shape of Things Unseen, which will be about memory and imagination. So, the plan is I don't know, you may have noticed that there is a QR code up there. And what we thought we would do is there's a couple of ways in which we can involve everybody here. Not everybody can get online, but for those of you that do have a smartphone and can have a signal, there are a couple of ways in which you can interact with us. So the first is that we are launching a poll, which I think we will be able to get up on the screen. And if you are able to access that, you can add your thoughts to what you think memory is. And we will watch that. It's a funny first starting word we've got there. Hopefully we'll have a bit more than just that. So as you think of words that you associate with memory, if you type them into when you go onto the screen, if you find the poll, you can type the words in, and we will watch that grow, and we will use that to inform our discussion a little bit. You will also see, if you can access that there is a Q&A session. And for the last sort of 15 minutes or so, we are going to try and answer some of those questions. So what you can do is there may be lots of questions that come in. We'll try and choose some of those when we get to that point. But if there's any that you particularly want asked, you can upvote it. So this is very modern technology today. It's already looking quite interesting. We have nostalgia and dreams as quite big subjects there. So while that grows behind us in the creative way, I thought it would be really nice to start, Harry, with just telling us a bit about how you went about this work and maybe something about the arc. My memory told me that we ended in a similar place to where we started, and it would be really nice to hear a bit about that process and how you got to that place.
Yeah, so the piece is sort of bookended by those two chords, which for the music theory geeks amongst us is a Lydian dominant chord. It's sort of there's a cheer for the Lydian dominant chord. It's a sign of a very good audience, which sort of is the closest representation we have to the harmonic series. And so I use that to signal the time before and after a life, because each section sort of builds through a single human life, really, starting before birth and the sounds that are heard in the womb. Mm. In fact, at that moment when there's the mention of the mother's song, that's the moment where you hear any theme that is really important kind of happens in some version there. And then I suppose you have this point where really the climax of the piece in some sense is that description of memory loss and Alzheimer's, and that takes place in Adam's fourth reading. And each one of those readings is a sort of misremembering of the last one and a degeneration of that one. So, so there's this sort of, I don't know, maybe a meta-narrative or something. It's the information around how a life happens, but no real description of the actual, story. It's not thematic in that way. It's the level above that, I suppose. And then I thought it was, there's a lot of text, and trying to set, scientific explanation and prose and poetry, that there's something interesting that music can do about how we engage with words that I think is kind of interesting. Being in a concert hall and just having the lights come down and so on is quite different to a symposium, So there's that sort of was the framing of those things.
And I was really struck by the fact that at the end there was that moment of peace, which was precisely what Adam had said is what we need to be able to consolidate what we've just been listening to and watching. So that kind of fitted really nicely as well. And can I ask a bit about how the interaction happens? So we've obviously got words from two sort of very different places. It's a really nice kind of interdisciplinary work. What was the order in which this happened? Who did you take?
Remember?
It was very much born out of COVID.
Born out of COVID.
Yeah,
COVID.
yeah.
We had regular Zoom meetings, didn't we?
That's right.
And,
Yes.
there was a kind of iterative process.
It started, I suppose it started with fairly casual conversations that we had, like many of these things that started over lunch. And the idea that we would collaborate together on something, that was fairly inchoate at that stage. And we hadn't really identified what it was that we wanted to say about our shared interests in the interaction of music and science and neuroscience in particular. And so we did start working on something quite different. And this is often the case, I think, when you look at a piece, there's an archaeology behind it. And we started, we got onto memory through Greek mythology, as I recall. And we started looking at goddess of memory in Greek mythology, and that led us to a more general discussion of memory.
I'm enjoying the fact that there's some recollection, some episodic remembering going on here. Synapses firing.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of themes that I'd really like to pick up, and the first theme that I think is really important is the one of forgetting. And there are a number of different ways in which forgetting is represented in this work. Obviously, there's the kind of scientific explanation, but it's represented in many different ways. So I don't know what the best order is to go in. Maybe, Adam, if you could talk a little bit about the difference. Well, I suppose let's start with a really straightforward question, which is, why do we forget?
I guess the most common form of forgetting is the form that occurs because we haven't really properly encoded information in the first place. And actually, it would be positively disadvantageous, wouldn't it, to remember everything that happens to us in great detail. So we really don't want to remember brushing our teeth every day. And probably the reason that we don't remember those kinds of very humdrum activities are that we don't invest in consolidating those memories. So, I mean, the process of memory, I think I describe at one stage in the text as botanical. It's a very, it takes a while to grow a memory in your brain, and that process of growth is fertilized by emotion and interest. And if there isn't very much emotion and interest in the first place, then the process won't evolve, won't develop. So there's plenty of forgetting that really is the result of failing to memorize. Then there is thought to be a process of forgetting which is the result of a kind of gradual decay in the strength of existing memories. That's a normal phenomenon. So memories evolve over time. And I quite often play this game. If you lie in bed at night and kind of rerun the day's events,
I do this as well. Is this a memory neuroscience thing?
It must be. It must be. You can recall really an extraordinary amount of detail, and even the following day, much of that has gone. So we abstract from the detail. So again, that's a normal process. The process by which it's called semanticization. So over time, you lose episodic details, and what's happened to you is integrated into your kind of overarching understanding of yourself and what goes on in the world. And then there's pathological forgetting, which is something quite different, which occurs when the synapses, those points of connection between neurons, which ultimately store our memories, begin to fall apart.
And I think it's really important for people to recognise that I think people are rightly quite afraid of pathological forgetting, but I think it's really important to recognise, like you say, that forgetting is a really healthy, normal process. And in our research, we found something like 3 days for most of the details of things that are not important are gone. And so I think it's something that, you know, we're very keen for people to understand that forgetting is a normal, healthy thing. And Sandy, you were saying earlier on in when we were chatting that you find forgetting a really interesting phenomenon in terms of forgetting and forgiveness was...
Yes, I think that's right, because one can realize or appreciate why the sort of forgetting that you've just been talking about unclutters our lives, in that we have finite capacity to remember, and therefore we don't remember things that are irrelevant, without being too sociobiological about it, that are irrelevant to our survival or to our proper functioning. So, for example, forgetting dreams seems to me to be something that we don't remember dreams. We wake up, we may remember them for a very short time, but 10 minutes later we've forgotten what they were, and that's because dreams are just so pointless. We feel that's another subject. Yeah. But I think that the very, very interesting issues about whether there's a duty to forget, there's a duty to remember. We will criticize people who don't remember our birthday when we take the view that they should. That becomes something to which some form of culpability attaches. But I think there's also a duty to draw a line on the past, because if we constantly remind ourselves about the past, I think that has a cluttering effect on the present, and we can't therefore deal with situations which may have changed rather dramatically from their previous existence in the past. And I think there are any number of examples of unhelpful memory at the moment, where people, for example, remember irredentist territorial claims, for example. And so people say, well, we always used to own that piece of land way, way back, therefore we're going to assert our right. It becomes a matter for the present. And in human relations, in ordinary human relations, if we remember every insult that we've received at the hands of our friends and others, we're really going to find our relationships become very cluttered and very difficult. And that brings into focus this role of forgiveness, because forgiveness is terribly important, because it enables us to move forward rather than remaining rooted in past conflicts of various sorts. So that raises the issue of whether there is a duty to forget. In ordinary language, we say to people, forget it. Why don't you just forget it and move on? That's what we're talking about there.
But of course, what neuroscientists and psychologists would say is that the more you ask somebody to forget it, the harder it is.
Right.
So I wonder whether there's almost a pathological remembering somewhere where people, they are in fact consolidating and strengthening the synapses of things that are particularly unhelpful. And I don't know whether you see that clinically, Adam, that people, where it can happen the other way around, so that people...
Yeah, I think memories are very important to group identity, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I guess sometimes people cultivate memories that would be better lost.
Yeah. I wonder whether, before we move on, because I want to look also at how the role this plays in looking forward and imagining, and because it's, as you've both described, actually, our memories are shaping our behaviour. Harry, can you say something maybe about how forgetting is represented in the work?
So I think one of the things that I realised maybe almost when I was finishing this piece was that as someone who writes music, you think that that the sort of tools are notes and rhythms and melodies and basses and harmonies and orchestration and all the rest. But none of that actually makes any sense whatsoever without some envelope that it's remembered in, you know. It's just a noise in an instant without a recollection of the melody that came beforehand.
So one note is only ever a note, unless it has a context.
And it's one of these things that's really, you know, outstandingly obvious, but something I hadn't thought about, really, you know. And the implications of that are, you know, a melody fits within our short-term memory very nicely, and then it requires some repetition for us to be able to recall it in another context later. But then also, more than that, you know, it also connects to developing an idea. You can think that a variation on a theme is almost like a misremembering of it.
Yeah.
You know, and actually a friend of mine who's a composer, Thomas Larcher, talked about that as his secret sauce for developing interesting new themes, was trying to remember it from last week and writing out a new theme, you know, actively, you know, using that to your advantage. So I think that there's that that reality that actually it really is the material of that. What's harder to grasp is, I suppose, the phenomenon, the feeling of turning memory into imagination. You know, this is why I'm interested in this book next year. Because that's what is actually happening when you're improvising or playing music. I mean, improvising is maybe an example where it's more felt. You know, you sort of, the jazz musicians say you go to the shed and you learn all the chops and you learn it all, and it becomes part of you. Then oftentimes it might be a year later that it comes out more intuitively. You know, when you learn a new compositional technique or a new way to improvise a lick or something, you shoehorn it into everything to get it into you somehow. And then, for me, it's more than a year, because I'm maybe slow at this, but over some time it's embodied in some way, and then it comes out imaginatively. So I think that in those two levels that it comes out. You asked about how it's represented in the piece, but it's hard to...
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about what you've just said is that you've automatically talked about many of the different types of memory that Adam was describing. So you've described that immediate short-term working memory, but music's a really nice way to describe those other elements of memory, because the repetition and the spaced repetition that Adam was talking about are precisely happening in almost any kind of music. Yeah. But I think also the talk of your description of intuition and embodiment and being able to come back to that maybe a year later. I don't know, Adam, if you want to say anything about neurologically what's happening, if Harry's doing, or a jazz musician spends, you know, weeks immersed in a piece of music and then leaves it, but comes back to it a year later and magically seems to be able to play things.
Yeah. So there are many things to say about that, and one is that the processes of consolidation which strengthen our memories over time they literally involve growth. They involve synaptic change, which consumes energy, takes time. So it actually is quite likely the case that if you practice something one day and find you're playing it better the next, that's because something's grown in your brain overnight.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely the case. The other thought I had in the back of my mind was that memories, of course, are kind of reconstructive process. So if you remember an episode from your past, it's not quite like, can feel a bit like it, but it isn't quite like playing a video. You're having to sort of reassemble the elements of the memory. It's a very active process, and of course, that process is a bit error-prone, and so changes occur over time, and that's one source of creativity. And
I think what's really interesting about what you've just said in relation to what you were saying, Sandy, is that that reconstruction of the memory, or the construction of the memory each time you do it, is in the frame of how flexible you are. And if you are somebody who gets very caught up in so we have the potential to reframe these memories.
Yes.
And sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. So we could rather than forgetting something, we could maybe reframe our past or think about it in a different way, construct it in a different way.
I think absolutely right. We're all familiar with people who rewrite the past, blatantly, or apparently blatantly. They describe what happened. Now, they may believe it. And of course, I don't know, Adam, you may have something to say about this, but is it not the case that the more you reiterate the past, the more you change it, potentially change it? So there are lots of people, we all know people, who genuinely believe, sincerely believe, something which is a complete distortion of what happened in the past. And of course, there are cases where these people will be manipulated politically at a fairly serious level by people who want to use them for particular political purposes. And so they will be presented with an untrue narrative that they will then believe, in which they think they actually experienced. So we can believe a lot, can we not, that actually really is entirely fictional.
There's the nice saying that in Russia the past is very unpredictable.
Yes.
Yeah, no, but absolutely. That, you know, there's decades of research now. In fact, there was very recently a study done to try and recreate the findings from, I think, something like 20 years ago, where they showed children pictures of them, the adopted pictures. And it was the original one did it with a hot air balloon and showed them a section of pictures, but also then showed them a picture of themselves in a hot air balloon. And by the time they'd retrieved it for the third time, a large number of people believed that they had been in a hot air balloon. And it's just been recreated in Norway with Viking ships.
Oh, yes.
So, but the same thing where people absolutely believe that, and they'll give very, very vivid descriptions of that experience that they never possibly could have had.
And there's rather interesting cases of people who appear to regress to past lives under hypnosis and are adamant that they lived in a previous time and will describe there. And of course, some of these people, there's the phenomenon of xenoglossy, where they start talking a language that they apparently never learned. And so that muddies the waters further.
I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Adam.
Just that there is a kind of neuroscience, neuronal level analogy to this, which is called reconsolidation. So when memories, at the point at which they're formed and for a while afterwards, memories seem to be quite vulnerable. So, for example, if you stop people forming proteins in their brain just after an experience occurs, they won't remember it because those processes of growth can't take place. It seems that when you retrieve a memory, it again becomes quite fragile and modifiable. It's just an interesting,
very
recent discovery.
Can we maybe talk a little bit about the role that memory plays in our prediction of the future? So this was something that came up in the work, and I know it's something that you're very interested in, Adam. So it makes sense, of course, that we use our past to predict what's coming next. Could you say something about the brain systems? Is it the same brain system that is going forwards and backwards?
Yeah. So it does seem to be, broadly speaking, the same brain system. So this is I think one of the most interesting discoveries from neuroscience over the last decade or two, that there is a set of regions which is particularly active in the resting brain called the default mode network. So if you just lie in a scanner and look at someone's brain activity, you'll find a set of regions that's more active than the rest. And that set of regions seems to be involved in recollecting the past and anticipating the future. It's not a newly discovered set of regions. It includes the hippocampus, which we've known for a very long time, plays a key role in memory. So this is the default mode network. And we know that people who have damage to this network are both bad at remembering the past and actually bad at imagining the future. So if you give people with amnesia the task of imagining a set of future scenarios, they really can't do it. They find it very hard.
And it's something that we don't necessarily think about, do we? We get very, and actually that can have very practical implications for somebody not being able to sort of envisage or inhabit that future space.
Yeah, absolutely. Another angle on this is that people who are generally bad at imagining, so people who lack sensory imagery, seem to have rather poor autobiographical memory, which kind of makes sense because when we remember our past, much of the richness of the memory is sensory.
Yes, and I know a lot of your work has been about that, and I'm hoping that some of that will end up in the new book. Really fascinating area. Did you want to add to this idea of the future? I'm interested in whether both of you, whether this was something that was new to you. When you started to have these discussions, I mean, it makes sense from the points you were making earlier on that we consult our past, but did it surprise you that so much of the brain was active so much of the memory was activated in imagining forwards?
Well, it sort of intuitively does make some sense. And, you know, when you watch children sort of develop their understanding of themselves, they're reconstructing their lives, and there's this sort of ambiguity about what's going on. So you can kind of see it develop there. In music as well, you have, I suppose, something which is related on two scales. So you talked about the anticipation, this prediction system. There's a book called Sweet Anticipation by David Horan that looks at that in relation to music, and if we are happy that what's going to happen next, so we hear a rhythm and we hear a few repetitions of it, we are just happy that we know what's going to happen next. And if it's interrupted, it's half a beat late, then suddenly our prediction engine goes, wasn't expecting that, And one of my favorite little sort of compositional tricks is to sort of move where the beat is underneath, and in the piece again, this is music theory land again, but you have these sort of metric modulations where there's an overlying pulse that becomes a new pulse, and so there are these kind of tricks, if you like, where you're just keeping some engagement by setting up an expectation and then changing it somehow, whether that's rhythmically like I described or harmonically or something else. But then in the longer term, I think there's this astonishing nature of music in how it, I can see on the screen there's this nostalgia part. There's this sort of warm emotional connection to remembering. And music seems to survive much more than other types of memory.
I think it's the most common when you look at the research of how people describe music. I think nostalgia is one of the top words that people use. So, and nostalgia is a really interesting concept because it's a slightly woolly idea from a neuroscience point of view, but we all know what that feeling is.
Well, there's an emotional element to nostalgia, It's not just a...
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've found very interesting about nostalgia is that people tend to, and maybe some of what you're talking about means that some of nostalgia can be a negative thing, and people I think often do think of nostalgia as being something that's maybe not very good for us, but actually the evidence shows completely the opposite, and that if you allow people to be nostalgic, they actually make better decisions about the future, and they can make braver decisions about the future. And possibly because you are activating those networks in the brain and allowing people to then project forwards.
Yes, it's interesting how nostalgia gets a bad press. That people feel they should feel guilty about engaging in nostalgic reminiscence. Whereas in fact, what you're saying is it could be really a very healthy thing to do. I think people are very interested in the emotional accompaniments of memory. There's a wonderful poem by the poet Craig Raine, which has the most haunting line in it, which is, "It is the onion memory that makes me cry." I think that's a lovely, lovely line. And it's so true that we feel regret, we feel, I suppose, a sense of loss when we engage in reminiscence. And yet it's a great pursuit, and we love doing it with old friends. After we've discussed our various illnesses and conditions, we move on to other memories.
Well, I think Adam very clearly made that point that memory, you know, one of memory's functions is that social component. It's a hugely important function of memory, is to allow us to connect with other people and to share those past things together, as well as to make plans for the future. And I guess we have to reflect on our relationships with people in order to decide whether we want to spend time with them in the future.
Exactly, and that's why it's really interesting to observe how when people meet, one of the first things they do is establish whether they've got friends in common.
Yeah.
And so somebody says, I'm from London. And you say, "Oh, do you know?" I mean, that's a ridiculous example. But we do want to establish common points. And if we can establish common memories, we are inclined, I think, to trust the other. The other becomes less foreign, less unknown. So memory there is acting as a very important form of social cement.
Absolutely, and of course, as human beings, we function much better in groups and with others than we do on our own. There's some very interesting words up here. I like the fact that exams is so high. I don't know how many GCSE students we have in the room at the moment, but nostalgia is the top there. But there's stories as well is high. And I think the stories, and I think that there's such a lovely parallel between the concept of story and the story of our life, because really episodic autobiographical memory, would you call it a story?
Yep.
And with chapters and a sense of linear time. I mean, all of the things that we see in a story exist in a neurological form in episodic memory, I guess.
Yeah. Which I think you had a question, didn't you, about whether this was whether any form of memory was unique to man? And
yes, we had a sneak preview of the questions, and one of them was whether was this question around animals, and whether animals.
And that's probably the strongest candidate for a uniquely human form of memory, the kind of this ability to travel mentally through time.
And create a sense of narrative, I guess. Yeah.
And without the narrative, the self suffers. That's the interesting thing. Now, the self is absolutely at the center of our human experience. We used to talk about the soul. We no longer talk about the soul, or not many of us talk about the soul in the same way. But we do recognize the self and the importance of the self. The self is the entity to which we attribute responsibility. It's absolutely central. And if you take memory away, the sense of the integrity of the self is compromised, and the self dissolves in a way. So again, we see a very fundamentally important role for memory there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to try and have a look at what questions we have here. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to have one last look at what we've got up there: downloading experiences, sights and sounds, Alzheimer's, catalogue, learnings, awareness, precedence, attachment, all sorts of things. If we can go back to the holding slide now, and I will see if we can have a look at some of the questions we've got on here. Oh, so we've got a question about dreams. Why do we remember some dreams but not others? And I guess before we jump to that, I just wanted to pick up on something you said about dreams and how we do tend to forget dreams often. I actually quite often use that as a metaphor to explain, well, not really a metaphor, but an experience to explain to others what it can be like for someone with very severe memory loss, someone with, for example, Alzheimer's or a severe amnesia. Because we do know what that feels like, but only temporarily. And we know what it feels like because we wake up and we think, oh, I'm absolutely going to remember this because it was such a vivid dream. And 10 minutes later, it can be gone. And I think it's very useful to tap into that feeling when you're trying to understand the lived experience of somebody who has memory loss. Because we so typically associate memory loss with a loss of intellect. And actually, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. And that's a way, I think, to understand it. But I don't. Do you want to maybe answer that question, Adam, about why we remember some dreams and not others? It's a lovely question.
It's a great question. So we know a bit about what happens to the brain during dreaming. So there is strong activation of parts of the brain that are involved in emotion and memory, in the sense particularly of recollection. But areas of the frontal lobe which control our thought are deactivated. And those areas seem to be important in filing memories away. So if you're to be able to retrieve a memory, you have to be able to remember where you put it. And the frontal lobes are involved in that process of filing and retrieving. So they're typically deactivated when we dream, which is probably why dreams are so elusive, so sort of evanescent. I suspect that the ones we remember are the ones that we come close to wakefulness during. So those frontal lobe systems switch on to a limited extent, and that enables us to retrieve them later.
And what about if we talk about them as soon as we wake up?
I think it's going to help.
Yeah, so I think it's dreams are really fascinating from a memory perspective, aren't they? I think
there's a example. I'm going to do the heresy of telling you about a dream now, which I really dislike when most people do it. But here we are, where I was on a bus in the dream, and I could hear people were clapping all these incredible rhythms. And I remember having this experience of, this is an amazing piece of music, and I was sort of aware of it. And I had this sort of rush of excitement, which is it was a highly emotional dream. And then I woke up because I was at the edge of it and thought, wow, I've dreamt music. This is incredible. And I thought for a second what it was, and there was nothing there. There was no actual anything, but it was a very vivid experience of this exciting moment of feeling like I had sort of imagined something powerful like that. So the emotional part was there, and it was, just nothing. Yeah.
I wonder if we're going to remember your dream tomorrow, Harry. I'll try.
And of course, there are examples of many composers and pop musicians who do have a moment and are able to record it there and then. And and then don't even remember having done that. Recording something in the middle of the night and then not remembering the next morning that they've done it.
Yeah, there are quite a number of examples of creative dreams, aren't there? Both in science as well as in the arts.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the other thing that's very interesting about dreams is how we can then remember it later if something triggers it. So you may not remember it at all, but then you have that experience of breaking a dream and it sort of momentarily flooding back, where presumably the file has been found. Accidentally.
That's rather eerie, isn't it? The idea that the memory is there. It's inaccessible and it requires just the right cue to trigger it.
This is another favourite question, and I think it's a really important one. And we might all have different views on this, but is modern technology making our memories worse? What do you think, Sandy?
Well, I suspect it is. People say that Google is making us stupid. It's giving us a great deal of information, obviously, but I suspect it is. But I don't know whether there's been any research into this. Do you know of anybody who's actually looked at whether there's been a deterioration in people's memories?
It's quite controversial. Adam, maybe you say what your views are, and then I'll add them, whether they're the same or different.
I think it's making my memory worse. I think I'm making less of an effort to remember information because I know that it's very accessible.
Yeah.
There is, of course, so Socrates was kind of worried about this, wasn't he? Was worried about the risk that writing was going to
Yeah.
to corrupt
Right.
our
Yes.
corrupt our memory. So it's not a new concern.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a really important thing. So one of the things I'm always very keen to say is that we've always had collective memory. We've always relied on other people for memory in some form or other. And the question, I think, maybe the thing that you picked up on there, Adam, is the effortfulness, because we do know, don't we, that if you are more effortful, and exams came up there, and we know that passively just reading something, this came up, you spoke about this in the work, that if you just passively read something, you're not going to engage with it in the same way as if you've had to actively seek it out. And maybe that is happening with modern technology. It's so readily available.
Yes.
I do know that there was a study, a really interesting study, it was about 5 experiments in one go, where they looked at whether people, what it did do is it made people think they knew more. So if you ask people, do you know the answer to this, but they have readily access to the internet, they will say, oh yes, I knew that.
Right.
And they will, because the sense of fluency, it comes so quickly, the answer comes as quickly as it might come to mind, and so therefore you have a sense that you owned that and that it was your thought. But when you actually experimentally tease it apart and you make somebody have a go at the answers and then later give them access, and I think that's really important, because I think our sense that regardless of whether it's making our memory worse or not, I think it is making us feel like we know more.
Yes.
Because the fact that it comes so quickly gives us that sense of ownership. And that is dangerous, because thinking we know things that we don't.
I think a fairly common example that people are familiar with is map reading. In the days when we had physical maps and we had to work out a route to somewhere, we actually would look at the streets and try and remember the street names before you set off. If you folded the map up, put it in your pocket, you tried to remember what the names of the relevant streets were. Now, if you look at your smartphone, as we now do, and you find your location on the map page of your smartphone, you don't pay any attention to any of the detail, and you just look where the blue dot is and in which direction the blue dot is going. So I suspect that means that we're laying down fewer memories of place because we don't have to.
Yeah, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree. If you,
Yeah.
if you follow someone around a city, you don't learn your way around it.
And I think there is actually solid evidence that is one good example where using GPS all the time, because we know that navigating your way around space is activating the hippocampus.
Well, it would be very interesting to do research on London taxi drivers, because London taxi drivers are the gold standard of memory, aren't they? They've got the knowledge, they've committed it, they've spent a couple of years riding around on little motorbikes and remembering all the streets. I wonder whether the new generation of London taxi drivers really know where they are.
Well, that research is being done.
Has it? And
It has been and is being, I think.
And what are the results?
I think it would depend whether it's Uber or Black Cab. Because I think the Black Cab drivers still have to do the knowledge, don't they? But there's a very famous study, which you probably know, that taxi drivers do have bigger hippocampi.
I'm aware of that, yes.
But they're following it up. Hugo Spears at UCL is following it up now. So keep your eye on the news, and we will find out.
Looking at the hippocampus in the Uber drivers as well.
I don't know
whether it's smaller.
I don't know if he's considered Uber as well.
We need to add that to this musical piece a little bit on.
So I think this is also a really interesting one. We've probably got time for maybe one or two. We'll see how the time goes, but maybe this is a quick one. You talked about Proust.
Yes.
Why is smell such a good trigger for memory? I mean, music is also a fantastic trigger for memory. We know that.
So there's a neurological story, which is just one piece of the jigsaw, but essentially the smell brain is very much mixed up with the memory brain. The regions of the brain that allow us to, that process smell, that allow us to identify and recognize smells, are intermingled with the regions that in which we lay down, that are required for laying down new memories. And smell goes very directly into the brain, so most of the sensory pathways travel through the thalamus, kind of a region at the center of the brain, before they go to the cortex. Smell goes straight into the kind of base of the brain. The olfactory cortices are in the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes, and yes, completely intermingled with memory. So it makes sense that memory makes neurological sense that memory should be so evocative. Smell should be so evocative.
Which ties in really nicely with Proust, the idea of this kind of sense of remembering.
Yes.
Which maybe almost it almost shortcuts that kind of conscious activating route and just gives us that sense of.
Yes, although you feel with Proust it was deliberate, because he spends pages talking about the nature of the flowers that he's looking at, or whatever.
Yeah.
So he's really sitting on memories, dissecting them, luxuriating in memory, which most of us don't do. We all have our Proustian moments, of course, but not to the same extent, and not as wordily as Proust had them. If you take the longest sentence in Proust's À la Recherche and type it out in ordinary type, it will wind 17 times round a wine bottle.
Wow. And I think that is probably a perfect place to end our discussion. And I expect everyone to go home and try that experiment. Because we like it to be interactive. We like people to go away with something to do. So I would just like to ask everyone, if you, when we close down, there will be another poll that will come up just on your phones, not here obviously, allowing you to just give brief reflections. If you can find the time to give us a sentence or two on your brief reflections, we'll try and leave it open for a little while if you would rather do it when you get on the train. But it would be really, really helpful for everybody here to have those brief reflections. But for now, thank you very much, Harry, for amazing work. And thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Adam.
Thank you.